Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. Welcome to all presenters, attendees, and my co-conveners, Glenda, David, Sue, and Amy. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respect to elders past and present. Today we have an excellent line of presenters, definitely right people in the room for this particular topic, COVID-19 and women's work. We have 6 presentations in total. 4 presentation before the break. We are going to have 20 minutes of break, and then we come back and we have another 2 presentation, and we finalize our session with discussion of all papers. Time is reasonably tight. We have presentation limits of 16 minutes each paper, which continues with 8 minutes discussion and 1 minute definitely change over between each presentation. So it makes it 25 minutes for each abstract. If you have any question from our panel, you can use the chat function and we can discuss them during the discussion time. And we also have a discussion of all papers at the end of the session. The program is already uploaded in the on-air platform, and you can have an access the program from there. We are going straight to the session, and we are going to actually start the session with our keynote paper titled Work and Care in a Gender Responsive Recovery, a bold policy agenda for a new social contract. Is going to be presented by Sarah Charlesworth, and her co-author is Elizabeth Hills. Thank you, Sarah. I would like to hand it to you to kick off the session, please.
Thank you very much, Mahan. So I'm sharing the screen, hopefully. You can see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Now, I should actually say, Mahan, that Elizabeth Hill, who unfortunately can't be here, and I are not really the authors of this policy statement. We are, like all good things, they have many mothers. And this is a policy statement that comes from the Work and Family Roundtable. What I want to do is just give a bit of background about the Roundtable. I see that we've got at least one of our members here, Alison Preston, and then talk a little bit about the process by which we prepared this statement, and then go through some of the key areas that we've made policy recommendations on. Okay, so the Work and Family Policy Roundtable was started back in 2005. Barb Pocock, who would be a familiar person to many people in the AIRANZ audience, and Liz Hill were the founding conveners. I was one of the founding members, and we've really grown over the years. We've now got 33 academic members from 17 universities and research institutions, and we're work and care and family scholars, gender work and care family scholars. Our aim of the roundtable is to propose, comment on, and collect and disseminate research that will really inform and advance evidence-based public policy in Australia. And our commitment here, which is about advancing public debate and policy initiatives, and I'm going to leave you to read the rest, is a commitment that we've had for many years. And when I was preparing this, and as you do, you see things through fresh eyes, I was surprised at how contemporary that policy statement or commitment is. Now, these are our current members. You'll see many familiar names, as I said, many familiar names to those who in AIRANZ conference. We cover a wide range of disciplines and a wide range of research domains, you know, from tax and superannuation, social protection issues, right through to domains around childcare, for example. There's a number of people involved in that space, but Deb Brennan, Elizabeth Adamson, Fran Press, for example. And we have always tried to work together in a collaborative way. And I'll just go on to some of the work that we've done. So since 2007, we have prepared what we call Federal Election Roundtable Policy Benchmarks. So we basically come together. Unfortunately, we've been able to come together face to face, but obviously last year we weren't able to do this. And often in member workshops, and some of our members who are members of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences have been able to wrangle funding to enable us to have really decent workshops spanning a couple of days. And we have fairly robust discussions and arrive at consensus policy positions around key issues at that particular time. And so we usually put this out well before the major parties have put out their electoral platform. And once they have, we then issue a very brief one-page scorecard. We have been inveterate submission writers over the years, including our very last submission that was led by Liz Adamson and Deb Brennan, was to the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19. And it was really dealing with what was happening in the childcare system under COVID arrangements. We do on occasions make statements. We engage very much in the media, and there's Work and Family Policy Roundtable members will, respond or say, look, we ought to be saying something about this. When it originally started, the roundtable was auspiced by the Centre for Work and Life at the University of South Australia, and then by the Women and Work Research Group at the University of Sydney. We don't have any of that administrative support, and over the last few years, Liz and I have existed on or tried to supplement the work of the roundtable on our access to internal research funding. And of course, in the year of COVID, that was frozen for most researchers last year. So while we used to exist on the smell of an oily rag, we don't even really exist on the smell at the moment. It's very much all hands to the deck, and we've moved very much, if there's an issue where someone has particular policy expertise, it might be Lynn Craig about the impact of the domestic division of labour in the home. It might be Miranda Stewart about the tax and transfer system. They are the ones who might lead a submission or lead a statement. We've also, out of one of the ASA workshops, we produced a book on childcare that was co-edited by Barb Pocock and Liz Hill. And we've also produced, back when it was a journal, a special issue of the Australian Bulletin of Labour on work and care policy in Australia. So we've been relatively active. Okay, so this is our statement, our kind of COVID statement, if you like. And we came together in October. It was a Zoom arrangement last year to really talk about what were the key issues that we needed to raise. And unlike our election benchmarks, where we really get down to some of the nitty-gritty, and something that I think has distinguished the Work and Family Policy Roundtable here in Australia, and there are now, of course, other similar research networks in other countries, is that industrial relations, working conditions is really a very central part of our policy analysis. So we came together in October. Various people in the areas of importance had prepared some of the key issues that we needed to discuss, and we then organised a Zoom discussion around these, agreed on several key points that we needed to hammer home, but also realised, because we weren't going down into a lot of the detail, what would be the high level areas that we needed to hit in a policy statement. So essentially our message that we hope to get through, and I think does come through the statement, is that what COVID has revealed is that the current policy settings for work, care and family are simply broken. And we really saw that in terms of providing protection against the pressures of the pandemic. And given the unequal gender impact of COVID, those settings are absolutely not up to supporting a gender inclusive and equitable recovery. So basically what we do here is to argue for a research-informed policy agenda and a new social contract. So we're focused very much on care, supporting care, both unpaid care, but also care work, but more broadly than that, the care infrastructure that we argue we should move to in Australia. So the key policy areas that we raised are these. So I'm just going to go through each of them. There was a big debate. Some of us felt that we were leaving out things. We typically always have something in our benchmarks around equal pay quite explicitly, for example. That was left out. We also have something in our benchmarks typically around retirement incomes, the tax transfer system, apart from a mention in our introduction in terms of our set of recommendations. We had to leave that out. Our aim was to produce something relatively short, but hopefully meaningful. So to this, this first area of inclusive employment and social protection. So these were our recommendations, and that was because our analysis was that the pandemic had really revealed the importance of decent work and adequate social protection, and particularly their role in safeguarding the well-being and security of families and communities, and indeed the economy. And so that includes a whole lot of things not mentioned here, but adequate pay, secure working time, paid leave provisions, you know, domestic violence leave, other forms of leave for work that can support women and men's equal right to combine family and community care responsibilities with stable and secure employment. And we really highlighted, well, what had come through the pandemic was that the temporary social protection had both shown us in a way what was possible when you increase the rate of job seeker in particular, but also what happened when many of the most vulnerable, many casual workers and those on temporary visas were excluded from a number of the protections that the government had provided. So we were really focused on having this decent floor of labour protections to really address the fragmentation of working time that's inherent in the kind of casualised work many women workers undertake who've got care responsibilities. And because unless we address that, we're really going to be reproducing across the life course income and working time insecurity, as well as a lack of access to careers. And we pointed out that women face lifelong penalties through the gendered intersections of care, social protection, the taxation system, and really that women were forced to then take on the risks of our retirement income system, which is organised around occupational superannuation. We've got equal pay in there as our fifth point of universal rights. I think an important aspect that the Roundtable emphasised in our last set of benchmarks is we don't just need the right to secure and predictable income, we need to create the conditions in which that can take place. So if you look at Australia, for example, we have a very gendered, polarised working time regime. Often women, when they have children, go into short hours, part-time work, often casualised work. You immediately see men, when they have children, start to increase their hours of work. And it was a strong view was that unless we actually have a cap on long working hours, which in Australia is an exception in international comparison, that's actually enforced, that's going to be fairly meaningless. There was also, I suppose, a real recognition that there needed to be not just a living wage through a decent wage, but also living hours, so that hours that are predictable, are secure, and that in fact we need to be really very much looking at shift notice periods, minimum engagement, and also sufficient guaranteed hours. And then moving on to the social protection system, we're advocating explicitly for a permanent increase to job seeker, but as well as also other income support income payments. I'm thinking particularly of some of the carer income payments there. Our next area was, and this was, I suppose, the area around which much of this statement is built, is recognising care as a foundation for a good society, but also a dynamic economy. So we argued that high quality care, both paid and unpaid, enables the development of human capabilities, wellbeing and economic productivity. And that what we've seen in Australia with inadequate investment in care services and supports and an uneven coverage of paid leave for workers in casual and precarious employment, this actually works to weaken our economy, and that inadequate care infrastructure, and by that we mean both physical infrastructure, but also the service infrastructure, can leave communities vulnerable and exacerbate inequalities. And we saw very much, particularly in Australia, first of all, the bushfires and then COVID, that without adequate paid and unpaid care taking place, the economy simply stops. So that here we're arguing that we need a number of elements, so that we've asked this time, I don't think we've ever come quite to this point, but the glimmer of what a universal free early childhood education system would look like, we got a glimmer of that at the beginning of COVID. It was on the backs though of ECEC workers, and that is absolutely basic to decent care infrastructure. We also need not only properly resourced and high quality aged care and disability services, but importantly, and this is what's come out through the relevant royal commissions into aged care and disability, but we need business models and governance arrangements that are transparent, that are fit for purpose, because this is public funding, and there has to be, we would argue, more effort put into making sure that the providers of those services, who are now contracted out for profit, not for profit employers, they have to be accountable for the expenditure of public money. We are increasingly having a look in the round table at what happens for people who have got care responsibilities for older adults later in life. And so one of the changes, for example, to the aged care system has been the demise of respite, access to respite care. So this is seen as absolutely crucial across all care services. In particular, end-of-life and palliative care is seen as really crucial to support unpaid carers, whether or not they're in the paid workforce, and an extraordinary number of them are, actually manage work and their responsibilities for older people for whom they provide support. There was a view, and it's interesting, in the round table, we often have fairly hot debates around paid parental leave over the years. And just as an aside, I think one of our singular achievements, we were advocating for a paid parental leave scheme from our inception, and I think played quite an important role in the lobbying for the scheme that eventually came around. And since then, we've been lobbying very hard for its extension. But we are looking at this idea of paid care leave for all workers, so that that workers have right to paid care. At the moment, you will be aware, under national employment standards, there's various rights, particularly for casual workers, to unpaid care. But that we're also talking about at least 9 months paid parental leave, which is including then, and this is an attempt to encourage more gender equal sharing of early childhood responsibilities between each parent. And then we were also having a look at broadly saying, as part of that infrastructure is this high quality workplace flexibility. So this is worker oriented flexibility that we're talking about, that actually is beneficial for them as well as their organisation, but also gives them voice, and this is something discussed in the last workshop, control predictability and, very importantly, working time security. Our next area was looking then explicitly, so we've focused this statement because if you're talking about care infrastructure, the care workforce is absolutely crucial to that. And building on what we have under our claims, if you like, our proposals under inclusive employment and social protection, in care, in particular, we're arguing that industry awards, which actually provide the conditions for most workers in the various care sectors, really have to be totally renovated. We really need to be unpacking the skills classifications. There tend to be very narrowly ill-defined skills classifications, which might have 40 or 50 cents in the levels between them if you get down to an hourly rate, and that they need to recognise and remunerate the skills that workers currently use. These vague skill definitions have led to quite a serious problem of allowing then employers, or providing the facility for employers to underclassify workers in the sense of putting them onto the lowest classifications in the particular award. And there was a strong view, and this was backed by a number of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable members' own research, that the federal government is now in the domains of ECEC, disability and aged care. It is the main service funder, and as such, we're really arguing for the government to be brought back into a central place. It really has got to step up and commit to policy and funding arrangements that are going to really seriously address the undervaluation of work in the care sector that underpins the structural pay inequity that's persisted and indeed worsened over many years. Just checking my time here, Mahan. I didn't turn my thing on. Can you give me how much longer I have? Another 5 minutes or so?
Another 5 minutes, yeah.
Right, great. So our last claim, and this is something we had in our in our last benchmarks, but we've elaborated it a bit further here, is very much about having decent evidence-informed policy, and really remarkably in Australia, and you can compare it to even countries like the UK, for example, there's very little rigorous publicly available policy evaluation that is undertaken by government or even commissioned by government. That's particularly the case if you look at workers with caring responsibilities. It's even more the case if you go under this assumption that women are this homogenous group, and you start to look at the what's happening for different groups of workers with caring responsibilities, including migrant and refugee women, women with disabilities, Indigenous women, older and younger women, LGBTQI plus women. So there's also, we've seen in Australia, and this is no doubt because the ABS has been very much squeezed over the last decade or so, but there's significant underinvestment in national surveys that actually track the prevalence and forms of non-standard work, and indeed its impacts on care and the uptake of various forms of leave by different groups of worker carers. And that means that there's a lack of accountability by government for the employment, care and policy outcomes as they impact on these different groups of workers. The one exception has been in recent memory, of course, is the evaluation in which a number of Work and Family Policy Roundtable members, thinking of Lyndall Strazdins, Marion Baird, Gillian Whitehouse, all ERANS members were involved in terms of the evaluation of the paid parental leave scheme. But any evaluations then haven't taken place. There were a number that were scheduled, and we've only seen a couple of those scheduled evaluations. So basically what we're asking is that there needs to be this gender analysis of government policies, that this has to be quite rigorous, and that advice needs to be then provided on a routine basis to the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit. We're arguing that the new policies and programs that were particularly those that were put in place to try and cushion the impact of COVID-19 really need to be subjected to a rigorous gender impact evaluation. And once again, going to the different impacts on different groups of worker carers. There's a strong view that among roundtable members that we really need government and also private sector data collection that tracks workforce characteristics and outcomes has to be disaggregated by gender. It's still quite shocking to come across quite routinely. One only has to think, for example, of the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. They will produce data uncut by gender quite routinely, so that you can't actually see what's happening with different groups of people in the community. And Australia, in terms of data around the gender pay gap, has been hamstrung because we really don't have decent data on managerial hourly wage rates, which would enable us to calculate, as most other countries do, an hourly gender pay gap, which in many ways is going to be more meaningful. As those of you who have anything to do with gender pay equity would know, in Australia, is the routine data we rely on for gender pay gap analysis is full-time workers only. Half of women working in Australia don't work on a full-time basis. So their pay, and part-time workers, and Alison Preston's done some work around this, really do suffer a pay kind of disadvantage relative to full-time workers. That's not even when you go to casuals, just when you look at hours of work. So I'll leave it there, but we have a website. Be very happy to take any questions about our process or indeed this particular agenda, but if any other, and I'll have to now look at the, if I stop sharing, I can have a look to see who are participants and see if there's any other. I can see Alison here, but if there's any other Work and Family Policy Roundtable members who are here, please assist me in responding or answering questions.
Thank you, Sarah. If anyone has any questions, we have another 7 minutes to spend on this paper, this presentation specifically, and definitely we continue the discussion in the evening today. Any questions? Sue, can you just let us know if you have received any questions?
Mahan, I haven't seen any in either of the current Zoom chat or the AirANZ on-air chat at this stage, sorry.
Thank you, Sue. Anyone, any questions? If, yeah, Emily has a comment. So Emily, would you like to turn on your microphone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, oh, thank you so much, Shara, for this very nice presentation. And well, I'm from Quebec in Canada, and Quebec is often seen as a progressive province and I was a little bit despaired and discouraged because all the things you've mentioned, most part of them, we have them in Quebec. We have affordable daycares, good parental pay leave schemes, and very progressive pay equal acts and so on. And despite all of that, what we've observed over the past 20 years is a stagnation. When you look at the indicators of gender equality in the market, on the labor market, what we've seen is a stagnation. So I was like, okay, if what we've done here is kind of the example for Australia or maybe other countries, what is missing? What have we missed?
Emily, I think you've got it in one. I think that, you know, and we do look to Quebec. We're often looking at Quebec, and we've actually had one of a colleague not from Quebec but British Columbia, where a $10 a day childcare scheme was being developed based on the Quebec one. I think what you're speaking to goes to the need for this constant evaluation. How's it working? Because I do know from work of Louise Bavin, for example, in Quebec, that while you have lots of progressive policies, particularly around the services that you provide, it is often, as we found in Australia during the brief free ECEC or childcare during COVID, it's on the back of the workers. So that while initially, particularly in ECEC, childcare workers were decently paid in relative terms to other Canadian provinces, that itself has stagnated. And I think in the broader feminist project, it means that you can never take your eye off the ball, that we really do need this constant re-evaluation and assessment of where we are. And that was partly sits behind the Roundtable's plea for this really decent evidence-informed policy making, because a policy sits within a broad context at a particular point in time, and it needs to be updated so that possibly back when you first introduced your heavily government subsidised childcare, you didn't have in mind the fragmentation of employment that's occurred across Canada and as well as Australia, but including in Quebec, which then undercuts some of the emphasis in that in your childcare round quality. But yeah, it's a slightly depressing message I have. You've got to keep at it.
Thank you, Sarah. We have one more question from Lisa. So we have only 2 minutes. I'm just worried about the timing, but okay, maybe we move on with this question, Lisa Heap. She asked Sarah, how can we amplify the work of the Work and Family Roundtable? Are there alliances that can be worked with to get other groups to adopt this statement? It is in the chat actually, Sarah.
Oh. Okay, yes, I see that. Thanks, Lisa. I perhaps didn't mention enough. We work a lot with other groups. We work a lot with, particularly say, for example, around paid parental leave. We work with various sex discrimination commissioners. We work a lot with civil society and unions. And she's much missed, but when Belinda Talkovich was you'd have to say, the de facto women's officer at the ACTU, she was somebody with whom we consulted regularly. We consult with many different unions in the space. When we develop statements, we send them out to a whole group of civil society groups, unions, but also importantly members of Parliament, and particularly around our election benchmarks, but including this statement to members of the opposition. So I suppose we try and amplify it, Lisa, but partly because we're now such a under-resourced organisation, it's very hard to be more proactive, so that even keeping our website up to date is something I've had to learn WordPress, and I don't do it particularly well. But so we are a bit limited. Hopefully we'll be able to get some more internal funding to help us to keep going. And yes, I've noted you've said there resources, which are always a problem. We have, interestingly, when we put our this statement up on the Carers Network, we were contacted by a similar group that organises feminist scholars across Austria, Germany and Switzerland, who have also put out a similar statement. So we're more conscious of building those international links. But when there are big policy debates, and so going back to once again around the paid parental leave, there were many robust discussions. I'm remembering Sharon Burrow, who was very cross with our position, because the union's position back then was that you needed just a basic level, and would be bargaining additional paid parental leave on top. And that was back in the days when enterprise bargaining at least looked like a viable way of getting improvements. But yes, it would be good to be able to amplify the work. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really mindful of the time. We had Glenda also raise her hand. Can we just keep it for the discussion time, Glenda? Thank you so much. Maybe we move on to our next paper, which is titled The Effects of COVID-19 pandemic on the working conditions and employment trajectories of women in Quebec between hope and despair. We have Melanie and Emily here with us who are going to present, talk about this paper. Thank you.
Thank you. I will share my screen. And, okay, hi everybody. I'm literally talking from the past because here in Canada it's still yesterday, so we are Tuesday, and it's kind of the middle of the night in here. So please, I apologize in advance if I'm not really awake as I would normally be. Well, the effect of COVID-19 on the working conditions and employment trajectories of women in Quebec. As I said earlier, before the crisis, we observed a stagnation of occupational inequality between men and women in Canada over the past 20 years. And that was particularly surprising in Quebec, since we have progressive social policies and good protection for women work and equal pay law and so on. What we've observed is that the COVID pandemic had bigger impact for women employment, and gender inequalities tend to increase with the crisis. So we're speaking of a she-cession in Canada. This is not me, this is not my invention, that's Statistic Canada talking about a she-cession. But what we also see, we can see light in this crisis. Maybe the crisis might be a unique opportunity to improve the working condition in many female-dominated sectors like nursing, care work, even education, and so on, because many invisible work from this in this sector had become essential work. So it's very clear when you look at the figure, there have been more job losses in female-dominated sectors like arts, services, retail, and so on. And so women are overrepresented among people who've lost the job. And women are also overrepresented when you look at working time reduction. And it's also linked to the number of children. The more children you have, the more working hours you've lost with the crisis. And a third effect is the amplification of a work-family conflict for many women. So really, it's after nearly 1 year of crisis, the effect of the crisis are well documented, and it is stronger for women. That said, in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada, many invisible occupations have become visible, and not only visible, but essential. For example, we discovered that nursing was a very dangerous occupation with a lot of health and safety concerns. And we also discovered that many people working in elderly care, for example, had no decent wages. So we had a kind of a debate about the compensation of the value of the work. So will the crisis be an opportunity to improve the working condition of those women? Maybe, the answer is maybe, but what we've seen in the rhetorics of the government of Quebec, for example, is that when the Prime Minister is talking about nurses and care workers, they are talking about guardian angels or everyday heroes. And everybody knows you don't pay guardian angels, you don't pay heroes. So why should we compensate for the very particular skills and competencies of this woman? So there is still this old rhetorics of dedication of the naturalization of women skills and competencies in health and care work. But in the public sector and in Quebec, the health sectors is 100% public. In education, we had bargaining processes. So we looked at the bargaining processes to see if the crisis was an opportunity to improve the working conditions. What we've seen is not very encouraging, because the first reaction of the government of Quebec, in this particular case, the government of Quebec is also the employer. It was a short-term strategy. We had, for example, labor shortage, so they gave premium, but only on a short-term scheme. So, for example, during the crisis, you have a COVID premium, but at the end of the COVID, obviously, you won't have the premium anymore. So that was not a long-term strategy of valorization of these jobs. So essentially, what we also observe is that there were no alliances between unions. So the government bargained with the health sectors, the education sectors. So it was more like an unilateral negotiation. And the government of Quebec wanted to settle very quickly, with the argument that at the end of the crisis, we'll have no money left. So take what we give you now, because at the end of the crisis, all the money will be gone to the recovery plan. So we observe a lack of social dialogue. But in short, the pandemic was not really an occasion to question the value of work, of women work, and of the invisible work. And we observe short-term strategies. That said, if it takes a she-covery to overcome a she-station. So it's quite clear for many politicians in Canada and in Quebec that the crisis affected more women. So the question is, will we have policies and public policies specifically dedicated to women and dedicated to improve gender equality in the workplace? We had hopes, but they quickly fade away, since the actors involved in the planning of the economic recovery are mainly men, which definitely questions the degree to which gender inequality will be addressed in their recovery plans. And the response of the government to the crisis is basically a recovery plan dedicated that relies on massive infrastructures, will be which means injecting a lot of money in the construction and transportation sectors, so male-dominated sectors. So we are facing a sheer recovery, but we had the response, the answer is a he recovery plan to the secession. So woman appears to be the forgotten one once again. And so hopefully we'll see some evolution. To finish, I will cite Véronique de Sèvres, who is the vice president of an important union in Quebec. She said, "We cannot limit ourselves to kind words in time of crisis. and one-time wage increase to highlight the crucial contribution of women to society. It is time to finally recognize that they have a decisive link in the chain of public services worthy of the name. So this is a response, and we hopefully will see more that the gender inequality will be taken into consideration in the bargaining with the public sector. And Melanie can add some additional information to that, and we'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. We have already Sue who has a question. Sue, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Emily. That was fascinating. That was really, really interesting. And Linda Colley and I have an interest in public sector gender equality. So I've got a couple of questions for you. Firstly, the first one is that with bargaining, are any gender equitable provisions relating to COVID making it onto the bargaining agenda, such as paid pandemic leave? And then the second one is, we know that with the public service, there were so many women doing those customer facing jobs, processing welfare payments, all that sort of stuff, who were the heroes, as you rightly said. And yes, they're not being recognised. How can their status improve?
We have some idea. We discussed that with Melanie earlier today because the bargaining process is still in progress. So we are at the beginning of the crisis. It's very interesting because the union asked the government to stop the bargaining process, say, okay, we will wait till the end of the crisis and then we'll go back to bargaining. And the government said, no, 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 we have to settle now. So it was clearly a strategy to settle quickly, and maybe to settle with the less money as possible. Melanie, do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe the union representative in Quebec will never say that, but the government is doing a great job in bargaining around right now. He has a very good strategy for bargaining table, and usually in Quebec we have union alliances during the bargain round, so education, health sectors, and they are all together, professional also, they are all together to bargain, and this bargaining round they split. And they split because they were not asking the same issues at the beginning of the bargaining round. But the government keep them very separately, and they target some group. And the government act by decree in this during the pandemic right now. So if you are taking, for example, all the nurses, the collective agreement do not exist anymore. So by decree, the government have decided to change the shift, the work schedule, the workplace. They can't take
time.
Yeah, they can't take holidays anymore. So this is it's a unilateral bargaining in the sense that they are governing by decree right now, and there is no social dialogue about the way they will manage the crisis. And this is very surprising for us, because in other sectors, in the private sector, for example, we can observe a kind of reinforcement of social dialogue. And we're not observing that in the public sector right now. And the strategy of government is really forcing an agreement, and they want a quick agreement. They do not want to bargain, because what is happening right now in the public sector, we have a lot of problem with the pandemic. We can observe that the system doesn't work, that we miss people in the health sector, we miss people in education, and we have a lot of problem, and those problems were existing before, but the crisis just amplified these problems, and the government don't want to really bargain on the really on the nature of the problem, the solution that we can find to solve the problem right now. And he just want a quick way to resolve the collective round, because this is a new government, and he wants to go through the negotiation without any conflict. But right now, it's surprising, because usually this is the nurses who had the better agreement in past year. They still have a better agreement than in the education or the groups. And this time the nurses settled an agreement. They were the first group to settle an agreement, and they settled for quite nothing. In fact, they do not win any big gains in their bargaining. And what is really surprising is that the people in education right now, they are voting for strikes, and they will use some moyen de pression. Help me, Ellie. Moyen de pression. They will use
pressure tactics.
Pressure tactics. Thank you. to try to face the government, because you don't want to negotiate nothing. So they are trying since a long time. They do not use strike very often in the education sector, and this time they are trying to push the government to really solve the problem in the school. So I don't know if I'm answering very well to your question, but
that's great. Thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah.
We have a question from Sarah Charlesworth to Emily. Are there other Canadian provinces that have responded better than Quebec to this SHE session?
Well, it's hard to say right now. The thing is, unfortunately, in Quebec, it's the worst of whole Canada in terms of number of deaths. It's terrible. It's really terrible. And number of cases. Right now, they have more cases in Ontario, but for a long time, the COVID strikes stronger in Quebec than anywhere else in Canada. So the situation was particularly desperate in Quebec. And the lockdown was last maybe longer in Quebec than in other Canadian provinces. For example, the Atlantic provinces are doing quite well with the number of cases, and British Columbia is also doing much better than Quebec. So that's maybe one explanation. And the other thing is, before the crisis, we had big labor shortage in the health sectors. So that's also a part of the problem. But it's hard to say right now. It's hard to say. I don't have the impression that Ontario is doing much better than Quebec in terms of recovery. It's a very conservative government in Ontario right now. Like in Alberta. So we'll see. It's hard to say right now. I'm sorry, I cannot give you a more precise answer.
Thank you, Emily. We have some ideas from SHE Recovery Agenda from Lisa. If you like, we can have a look in the chat. And David, would you like to ask your question? We still have some time.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's partly been addressed already in response to earlier questions, but I guess, well, one thing I'd say is that this move from tripartism to unilateralism is sort of like the opposite of the appearance of things in Australia, because after the coalition Conservative government at the federal level had been extremely anti-union for many years. They suddenly went into the rhetoric of corporatism and tripartism around about May and June and set up these various working parties. Now, that sort of dissipated into a not very satisfactory outcome for anybody, but the direction the movement of the rhetoric was the opposite of what you were saying. So in Quebec. So I guess my question is really, so you presently have, if I understand what you've said correctly, you presently have a unilaterally determined system in place for the management of working time in the hospitals and health areas and so on. But separate to that, there's been an agreement negotiated with the nurses. So that has happened, but it doesn't really take effect until these unilateral decisions are lifted. Like, how long is this unilateral arrangement in place for, and when will things go back to a more normal position? Or do you really see this as being like an attempt by the state to permanently shift relations from being pluralist to unilateral?
Sylvain, Émilie ou?
Vas-y.
Ben, la question, c'est, tu peux m'aider, en fait? Just a moment, David. I just want to understand very well what you just answered. T'as-tu compris, Émilie?
Well, I try. She's the expert in
I know, but I'm not sure I understand well the question of the David's question.
So I guess my question is, you have a unilateral system of determination of wages and working hours in particular in the health system. How long will that persist for? Are things expected to go back to normal negotiated arrangements afterwards, or is this the start of an attempt by the government to a permanent shift?
The thing is, we don't know right now, and the unions don't know. I just talked to someone of the nurses union before the conference, and I was asking him a question about that. And I was asking him how long the decree is supposed to be in force, and they say as long as the crisis will go on. And for the moment in Canada, we don't have good expectation until 2022 because the vaccination process is not going very well here, and we have some problem with the vaccine. So for the moment, the decree is in force, and last summer nurses didn't have their holidays, and they still can't take their holiday time. They can't choose their working schedule as before. And for example, a nurse is in a clinic in a small town. Right now, she can go, his manager can say, okay, now you're in a little clinic, but now you're going to the hospital and you will work on the night shift. You were on the day shift since 20 years, but now you're on the night shift because we need you. And they can't choose anything.
They took school nurses and they sent them to the hospital.
This is the real problem. So this is the decree, the minister decree that allowed all the managers to use nurses in the way they want. So the collective agreement do not exist anymore in the nursing sector. And it will be the case as long as the government will just say, okay, the decree is over and the crisis is over.
Thank you, Melanie and Emily. Maybe we should move on to our next presentation by David Pitts and colleagues. The paper title is Working from Home During the COVID-19 Pandemic, a cross-national study of women in the universities. David, please share your presentation. Yes, thank you. David, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, excellent. Oh dear. Now Now, I can't see the slides. Can you see the slides?
Yes, go into slideshow though.
Okay,
Beautiful.
and is that right? There should be the title page with 100 names on it. Well,
Yeah.
28 names on it. Does that quite
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay.
That's correct.
All right. So this is a project that, as you can see by the list of names, involves a lot of researchers, but I'm the front person today. The people whose names are in bold are people who are probably here. I think, in fact, most of them, I think, are probably on this panel. So when I get a difficult question, I'm just going to say, hey, can you answer this? It's a project looking at university staff and how they are affected by the working from home arrangements that happen under COVID. And it started with a tweet. And the tweet came from this person who was one of the editors of the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, and she said, there's been a negligible number of submissions to the journal from women in the last month. This was in April of last year. Never seen anything like it. And I thought that sounded really interesting and problematic for a lot of people working at the university. And did a bit of scurrying around and found some other things also written around about that time in late April about the impact that the pandemic was having on female academics. There was this lovely little piece from the Annals of the Florida Academic Mums. I'm not going to read it out, but if you start scanning your wires down, then you'll get the sort of idea of it. And I said to the Vice Chancellor, this is something we really need to investigate, and particularly in the context of promotions and performance appraisals at our university. And she was interested, but she said, well, I wouldn't want Griffith to be the only university involved. So scouted around with a lot of colleagues, many of whose names you see and whose faces you may even see, and this project came out of it. So I'll come to the project shortly, but first of all, just look at very, very briefly some of the possible theoretical considerations. What are the factors that might influence the patterns of adjustment that people have in university setting to the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly the working from home. We're basically in Australia, most universities shifted from normal work to working from home in late April or early May, and it was a pretty quick process in most places. Now, this is a study that covered both academic and general and professional staff. But one of the possibilities as to what could influence how people adapt is the extent to which people's prior preferences were being met. So academics were already spending some of their time working from home. General and professional staff were not. They were spending virtually all of their time on campus. But these preferences, of course, aren't neutrally determined anyway. They're determined in the context of the household division of labour. So people might want to spend more time working home because they've got particular responsibilities, as they see it, at home. But you would expect that the extent to which people are already doing what they wanted to do would have some impact on it. Something else that would be important, though, would be the changes in the labour process, partly about, well, are you more supervised or less supervised? Are you able to supervise people more or less than before, exercise more or less control? When Sue Racia is giving her presentation shortly, then she's looking in particular at the role of middle managers using partly data from here. But also, of course, for general and professional staff, there was the issue of doing a lot of computer-mediated stuff in the campus that is now being done at home, or personally mediated stuff that was now computer-mediated at home. For academics, there was really, for teaching, a fundamental change for many in the way teaching was delivered, going from on-campus face-to-face classes to online delivery of courses. And that was really a totally different method of work. But the other thing that is a consideration here is the types of knowledge work that are used. Like most university workers, be they academics or general professional staff, if they're working in an office of some type or other, they're knowledge workers. But there may be different types of knowledge work, and that may influence their susceptibility to interruption by the shift to homework. So for this, we found it useful to distinguish, at least at a theoretical level, in between what we call sustained knowledge work and episodic knowledge work. And most people do some combination of the two. So it's really more like the tasks rather than the jobs that fall into this category, because people typically do more than one task in their job. Sustained knowledge work is the sort of stuff that requires focus. Episodic knowledge work is the stuff that can be done in smaller blocks of time. It doesn't matter so much if you're stopped from doing it, you can go back to it. Whereas the sustained stuff, it can really be a problem if it's interrupted. So writing research papers falls into the sustained knowledge work category, whereas a lot of data collection is not. It's more episodic. You can work on a spreadsheet, or you can collect data through whatever methods it is, arrange interviews. The process of collecting data isn't so much requiring focus as the actual writing of the research papers. Some aspects of teaching fall into one, some into the other. A lot of the admin work that academics do falls into the latter category. It's more episodic. And indeed, the work of general and professional staff referred to here by HEW, that's just a classification system used for general and professional staff. That sort of work tends to have a higher proportion of episodic work at the lower levels and a higher proportion of sustained and more strategic work at the higher levels. So that's a fairly bold generalisation. How does this fit in with gender? Well, basically, the household division of labour gives disproportionate tasks to women, and so we hear a lot about multitasking that's done by women, that has to be done by women by virtue of the way the household division of labour is organised. And that can tend to make sustained knowledge work harder to do at home. Now, in academia in particular, sustained knowledge work is really reified because it's the production of high quality research papers that make your mark as an academic. And so the reification of that can lead to probably reinforce the idea, or the long-held idea, that women were unsuited to serious academic work. And you see this fairly recently. Like, there was a paper published, I think, in Science in about 2015, Leslie et al., which was trying to explain the different extent of female involvement in various occupations in the science fields, as due to those fields' reliance on brilliance as opposed to hard work. And those that required brilliance were less suited to women. Of course, women were less brilliant than men. And so if you've got something like a pandemic that pushes sustained knowledge work into a hostile environment, then that can be particularly disadvantageous to women because of the way they intersect with domestic responsibilities, even if it's easier to meet those domestic responsibilities because you're spending more time at home. So that's a bit of the background to it. On to the study. It's basically an online survey that we did across 14 universities, 7 in Australia and 7 in Canada. This is what the front page of the website looks like to people who went into it, with the grey bits, of course, replaced by things that would identify the universities that were involved. We had knowledge workers, the academics are really quite unusual compared to other white collar workers. Linda and Sue coming up after me are going to be talking about public service. There's a lot of similarities between general and professional staff and a lot of white collar work. Academics are a bit more unusual in the high degree of autonomy that they have and the high amount of working from home that they were previously doing. So, and that's how many observations we had, about a bit over 3,000 academics and something over 7,500 general and professional staff across the two countries. And so the questions, well, we had some that were basically asking people, how much were you working from home versus working on campus before COVID, during COVID? What do you prefer out of that? We had some questions asking whether various things had increased or decreased. We had a Likert scale questions there at the bottom about whether they agreed or disagreed with various statements. And we also asked them about the ideas, this is called word association stuff, where first thought that comes into your mind when you're asked about this particular working arrangements during pandemic, and then to rate those ideas. So we went back and we looked at the wording ourselves to make sure that people had rated them positively, negatively, or neutral. And on almost all occasions they had. So it's pretty good data. So, and this is the response from that first question. About how did you find the experience of COVID? What do you consider as the first word, positive, negative, or neutral? And what you'll see there is that the academics, which are the left-hand part of the screen, basically they're much more likely to give a negative response. About 50% of them gave a negative first word, only about 30% gave a positive first word. For the general and professional staff, much more positive, around about 55–60% were saying it was positive, and a bit under 30% saying it was negative. And it was actually fairly similar patterns when we asked what their second and third word that they thought of was. So this is pretty representative data. And you'll also see there are some gender differences in there, but they're not all that big. Women very slightly more likely, I don't think that would pass the significance test amongst the academics, to be positive, but also to be negative about it. And that pattern a little bit stronger on the positive side amongst the general and professional staff. What's the preferred arrangement for working from home? Well, very few people wanted to spend all their time working from campus or all their time working from home. Most people gave responses where they're doing part of their work at home, part of the work on campus. It's clustering around about the 50-50 mark. Women are giving slightly higher responses than men in terms of how they'd be, what proportion of time they'd be wanting to work from home. Not hugely more, but a little bit more, and that's both amongst the general and professional staff and amongst the academics. When we asked them what impact did the working arrangements under COVID have on the number of hours you actually spent on work, well, both groups said that it had increased. Academics said it increased by more, and within academics, female academics said it increased by more than it. So 70% of female academics said the time spent on work had increased, 65% of men said that. And corresponding probably with that, women were more likely than men academics, and academics were more likely than general and professional staff to say that work made them feel more tired. There's not very many, particularly amongst the academics, who said that work made them feel less tired. Now, amongst the academics, we asked them to tell us, okay, so did your time spent on teaching, on admin, on research go up or down? Well, time spent on teaching, 3/4, 4/5 or so of them said time spent on teaching gone up. And particularly due to, I presume, the major changes in the labour process of going to online teaching. Very few said the time spent on teaching gone down, and women a bit more likely than men to say the time spent on teaching gone up. On admin and service, not quite as many saying it had gone up, but it had gone up quite a bit more for women. 62% of women said it had gone up, and 53% of men said it had gone up. And interestingly, there's not much gender difference there in time spent on research, even though there were gender differences, women spending both more time on teaching and more time on admin. There's a little gender difference in the drop in time spent on research. A little bit more than half of women, a little bit less than half of men in Australia, and a couple of percentage points less in Canada, saying the time spent on research had gone down, but fairly similar. And really that's because, or that is why, women are spending more time on their work than men, because they've been trying to maintain some sort of time spent on research while having increased time spent on teaching and admin. But the interesting thing is looking at how that time on research is spent. When you're asking people about your ability to do field work or lab work, to collect data for research, everybody says it's gone down. Well, 4/5 or more of people say it's gone down. But the gender differences aren't all that big. In Canada, they're basically non-existent. In Australia, there's only 3 percentage points difference between men and women. And where they're saying their ability to collect data has gone down. But when you look at this ability to finish or submit research papers, which was really what drove the project in the first place, see a much bigger gap and gender gap there. 56% of women saying that their ability to finish or submit research papers have gone down, compared to 46% of men. So the overall time on research has gone down. There's been this big drop in data collection, but that's not really very gendered. But the big gendering is in this ability to submit or finish research papers. We also had a question on applying for grants. So it was somewhere in between the two of these.
Sorry, David. I just the time is almost up. Just if you can just wrap it up.
Okay, so we found the time spent on domestic responsibilities went up a bit more for women than for men, but where it really did go up a lot for women was, well, where it went up was when you asked them, has your time spent gone up a lot? You see that 26% of women said that, women academics said the time spent on domestic responsibilities had gone up a lot, versus only 19% said it had gone up for men. There's a few other patterns there that I haven't put charts in for, but I'll come back to that if necessary. So there's some questions raised by these data, some of which I can't get into here, like why are there gender differences that are greater in Australia than in Canada? But also why the gender difference is greater amongst academics than amongst the general professional staff. And why amongst academics is the big gender difference in research, not in collecting data, but in finishing and submitting research papers. And we had this does seem to go back to this concept of sustained knowledge work that I mentioned at the beginning. One of the questions we asked people was to agree or disagree. During my non-work hours, I don't think much about work at all. And that's something that is going to be very related to the extent to which they're doing sustained work at home. It's very related to whether it's academic or general admin work. 89% of academics disagreed that they don't think about work at all at home during the non-work hours, versus only 65% for general professional staff. And that in turn correlated a lot with this publishing outcome. So amongst those who couldn't switch off, 56% said their ability to publish had decreased. Amongst those who said they could switch off, only 37% felt their ability to publish had gone down. And yet that difference is much more when you're looking at this issue about data collection. There's a bit of an impact there, but there's not much of an impact. So one of the tentative conclusions we draw out of this well, that the household division of labour makes sustained knowledge work harder at home for women than it does for men, and that COVID-19 arrangements that have pushed sustained knowledge work into this hostile environment, and that hostile environment is especially disadvantageous to women, even though it may make it easier to meet domestic responsibilities. So people, you know, there's pluses and minuses all around here. The plus is I can do this stuff at home that was really hard for me to do before, but geez, it's work. It's eating into my time to write papers. So it's easier for women to be diverted into these intermittent household tasks. So gender norms appear to be reproduced more strongly amongst academics than amongst general staff, and talk about that in the questions if needed to. Where the household division of labour does have a real effect, then the effects of COVID on sustained knowledge work appear to be highly gendered. So the differences in the labour process that are referred to do appear to heighten the gender effects, because this interference in sustained knowledge work affects the ability to publish, and it affects the ability to publish differentially by gender. And this helps to explain these gender patterns we've seen in submissions to journals and to publications. And that's it, folks.
Thank you so much, David. Any question from David? We have limited time. We only have 4 minutes for discussion for this presentation. And
I think there's just one comment in the chat in relation to, would David please share the slides from Roya? I think the slides that you were talking about that you had not put in from the survey.
Oh, okay. All right.
Any other questions before we move on to the next presentation?
There's a question from Alison Preston in the on-air chat. David, nice to see the presentation and hear the story around the data. If you were presenting this to HR at Griffith or UWA, what message would you be giving to HR for how they need to organise or manage work for general staff, given the nature of university work has changed? Might add that preliminary analysis by March colleague finds that satisfaction working at home mediated by job precarity, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I did present this information to the Griffith senior managers, particularly in my own faculty, and that's very interesting. Yes, very interesting. Who knows how much attention they pay to it? I think it's got some pretty clear implications for performance appraisal and career paths, particularly for academics. But there's also implications there for genuine professional staff. And I think the story is that, you know, there's a real mixed bag going on here, because when you shift the location of work to home, then you save a whole lot of money in one respect and get efficiencies in some respect. You create a whole lot of inefficiencies in other respects. And it probably varies a lot, not only between work areas, but also I suspect between households and household types. And we haven't yet really had the opportunity to do analysis by household types, whatever, to see what's going on there. So like the bottom line I said was that you can't just make these unilateral decisions on your own. You've got to let the staff have a really big say in what goes on. You see that in the heterogeneity of people's responses as to how much do they want to be working from home. It's not all one or all the other or all the particular balance. People's preferences are all over the place, and that reflects their different circumstances. And management can't just say, oh, well, we've got the solution for this and we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and boom, boom, problem solved. It's not like that. And it's not up to academics to say, oh, you know, this is what you should do, X% this and Y% of that. No, you've got to find out from the people who are directly affected about what is it that they think is going to be the optimal arrangements, and do your best to work around that. That's going to be the best solution for management in these situations, whether it's dealing with academics or general professional staff or whatever.
Thank you, David. We had Melanie raise her hand and Glenda. Can you go first, Melanie?
Yes, thank you, David, for the presentation, but I have to tell you that it's a little bit depressive to hearing that. My question is, the impact of COVID-19, we can feel it right now because we are maybe women are really pressured right now from homeschooling, doing the papers, doing the job, usual job, etc. But it will have a long-term effect also. After the crisis, we will have to restore the research project. We will have to restart all the things that we have to do to get a promotion. And my question is, in your project, did you have a kind of analysis of the solution or the way we will manage the long-term effect of the COVID crisis on the woman trajectory of employment? Because this is true for professors, for academics, but it is also true for all the jobs, professional jobs in which you have a kind of meritocratic. You know, do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is true for academic, but it's also true for other kinds of professional. So did you have a look on solution for long-term impact on the career trajectory or something like that?
Well, the process of collecting the data doesn't itself lend itself to that, except to the extent that some of the people we're collecting information from are managers themselves. And we had some open-ended questions in there, some of which I showed you, and some of which are just broad open-ended questions at the end. So, and Sue Racia actually in the session after next is going to be talking about some of them too. But I think like there is a general problem in universities that's been building over the past 20, 30 years of the rise of the neoliberal managerialist university that is very top-down and top-heavy, and where the people high up think they have the answers to everything and they know how to make all the right decisions. And that means that in situations like this, where all sorts of complexities arise, they don't have a clue, but they still think they have a clue. And so in a sense, that's why I'm getting at the importance of you know, increasing industrial democracy, or whatever you want to call it, employee involvement. A word they like to use at my university was engagement, although they've stopped using that in the last couple of years, but it's very weak anyway. But anyway, of actually involving the staff in the decisions about structures and promotion processes and so on. I think that's really important, and that's probably the single most important thing that can be done to improve the trajectories. Like there's some things like, like our university wasn't as bad as some of them, I think. There's sort of been like a step back from the normal performance appraisal processes, and a sort of step back from the normal promotion processes, though I'm not really sure how that's going to work out. Like that may make things worse rather than better, I'm not sure. The performance appraisal thing is probably a good step. But it's not like a central focus of the project, but I'm sure these things we're hoping to have some answers out of it. And I think some of the interviews that Sue has done, some of which were after we did the fieldwork for this project, will help in that regard as well.
Thank you, David. And maybe we just have our last question, Glenda.
Yes, I just wanted to comment that I've analysed the open-ended questions for the Australian cohort in the survey, over 5,000. And most people said something good, something bad. When you read the good comments, you know, everything's rosy. But when you get to read the negative comments, sometimes I was nearly sitting there crying, because some people's personal circumstances at home could be because of family involvement. They could be living alone. They could be living in extremely small apartments or share houses in particularly Sydney and Melbourne. Their circumstances have been dire. And so, although this is not a majority, but what it brought home to me is the inequality that now comes in when you say to people, you have to work at home, on so many levels, you know, and from people who, you know, etc. I won't go into it. There were people in absolutely dire circumstances trying to work from home. So my thing is, it does introduce a new level of inequality to the workplace and to certain workers. So my great take out of this, or fear out of this, is that people will be told to work at home awful lot of the time, and it introduces this huge inequality of circumstances, either their own personality, living alone, their physical circumstances, their family circumstances, all come into play. And so I think this is something that the survey can recognise out of these comments, that working from home is far from equal for everybody and their circumstances. So mandating work from home or even work in the office is a bad thing at the end of this. There should be choice of the individual, because some people's circumstances do not allow for it.
Yes, I agree with that.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Glenda. Maybe we move on to our next presentation by Linda and Sue. The title of this paper is Working from Home During the Pandemic, the Experience of Men and Women Public Servants. I would like to hand it over to you, Linda.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And so the content of our research is similar theme to David's. We ask slightly different questions, but yeah, there's some. If at a more usual Airens conference, we'd be sitting with beers going through all of these charts at a table somewhere, David, but never mind. Okay, so David's covered a lot of the context. I don't need to talk in very much detail about this. So in the 1990s in Australia, we see increasing flexibility in the hours of work and the place of work, increasing numbers of policies. Public service were leaders at the time in policies. But at the practice level, it was another story. There was a much slower uptake than anticipated, and there were policy changes over the decades to try and revise this, with an all roles flex policy most recently, making very little difference. There's also a skewed uptake. About 30% of exec level or senior manager level employees have worked from home, some or a lot of the time, but less than 15% of other Australian public service employees who we studied. And the reasons can include some concerns around productivity and the really equivocal research findings on whether the benefits outweigh the costs. Sue Williamson and I and Ray Cooper and Mariah Foley did some research in 2018 on 4 state public services. And the questions were generally about how middle managers progress gender equality, but we did find a lot of focus on flexible work. People who joined our panel on Wednesday heard Sue speak to this. But we identified considerable resistance, even though the policy framework is there. There was considerable resistance to giving people access to that policy and a nervousness. So a real disconnection between the policy and the practice. So the pandemic, of course, washed away that resistance. It forced the hand. All the excuses about you can't do this job at home because of technology, because of customers, whatever, was overthrown by the need to contain the pandemic. So forced their hands, and people were working from home. So we treated this as a working from home experiment. Unlike the academic sector, where academics are much more used to a working from home arrangement, it's less common in the public sector. So we thought, let's study this experiment. It was always an intention to study it during the pandemic and then to study it afterwards as well. Okay, so 2020, we partnered with the Community and Public Sector Union, who cover a lot of Australian public service employees, as well as Northern Territory and ACT. We conducted a survey, and our questions had 3 general themes. What was your past working from home experience? What was your 2020 experience? And what are your future preferences? Survey was administered through June, July. At the time, lockdown had ended in most states. It was before Victoria went back into their next lockdown, so there's fairly common experience of the real differences across the public services, where the Australian public service we were studying was already trying to get people back to work and already putting out transition back policies by the end of May. The other public services were generally a little bit slower. So we had a sense at the policy level, at least, that this previous resistance was going to continue. So we had more than 6,000 respondents to our survey. Even though it was administered by the CPSU, they have a lot of non-union members on their mailing list, and 1,000 of our respondents were non-union members. 1,400 identified as having supervisory or managerial roles as well. So we had a good cross-section of union members, managers and non-union members. To tell you the punchline in advance, even though this is a gender panel, we expected significant gender differences, but we were quite surprised at how few there were, but also where they were. Okay, let's leap straight into the data. So here's a slide which reflects the level of working from home before the pandemic. So the orange bars are the people who did work from home. So we find not too much gender difference. We had a female, male and other gender categories, but we found, 70% of people didn't work from home before the pandemic. So after the pandemic, or during the pandemic, sorry, we had up to 85% of people saying, who responded to the survey, saying that they worked from home. This is slightly higher than, I think there's an estimate of around 70% of public servants worked from home during the pandemic. So we think that some people who didn't work from home didn't complete our survey maybe. Anyway, huge change, complete turnabout in the number of people who did work from home who hadn't previously. Okay, so 16% of the sample didn't work from home. So we asked them a few questions, and they could choose multiple reasons why they didn't work from home. 2/3 of them said it was about job reasons. Half said it was about organisation reasons, and 1/3 said it was their own choice. And many of the free text comments were related to this organisation reasons, about managers' decisions or permissions applied inequitably in some cases. And it suggested to us that the old policies were still being applied, even though there was a broader permission to work from home, that some managers were sticking to previous policies. We also asked those who didn't work from home how they felt about those who did. 80% said they were happy for colleagues who were able to work from home, but they expressed in the free text, they expressed a lot of other emotions, and some of the most common words were luck, envy and fairness. And this is a fairly typical statement. It felt as though not all employees were treated equally. For example, I was not given the option to work from home and my colleagues were. It felt as if my well-being wasn't as valued as highly as others. So there's a real danger with discretion in policies, of course, that creates an us and them if it's not fairly exercised. And we saw a fair bit of that amongst this, around about 1,000 people who didn't work from home. Okay, so we asked questions around the practicalities of it. We asked people about the number of hours that worked from home. 2/3 continued working their usual hours, and not very much gender difference there at all. The blue column is women, which is around 64%, and around 67% of men said they continued to work their usual hours. When it comes to working more hours, we found that slight difference. More women said they worked more hours, 29.4%, 27.7% of men said they worked more hours. Very few people worked fewer hours, and some of the anecdotal comments in there were I just got my work done faster because I wasn't being interrupted all the time, and very few people took leave. Sorry, I've just said all those things. Of the 1/4 who worked more hours, we asked some follow-up questions. Half cited increased workload during the pandemic. So you've got to remember, this is the federal public service. We have people in the tax office processing low superannuation, early release claims. We had JobKeeper, JobSeeker managed by the Department of Social Service. So we have a lot of policies being both written and implemented at the federal level. 1/3 said the reason for working more hours was that there was no commuting time, and they were translating this commuting time. If they went to get the train at 7 o'clock, they would instead go and sit at their desk at 7 o'clock. So they were translating the commuting time into working time. And 1/4 said they just lost track of time. With that lack of boundaries between home and work, they tended to lose track of time. We haven't really worked out what to do with this piece of information, but as Sue was looking through the free text comments around number of hours, there was a real theme of guilt, with a theme of people needing to justify working from home and make it sure that it absolutely appeared like they were productive. They didn't want to lose this benefit. Then another group of people who felt they needed to compensate for the things that were going wrong, for tasks being slower, for dodgy internet, and for all of those things that were making work more protracted. They felt they needed to compensate from that rather than have the organisation accommodate that. Okay, so as well as the how many hours, we asked about when they worked, their span of hours. So we found 74%, 3/4 worked their usual pattern of hours. And this is very little difference between men and women. Slightly more men worked their usual pattern of hours. 14.7% said they chose to work outside their usual hours. Again, very little gender difference. 5% said they felt obliged to work outside their usual hours due to household obligations. And we thought this was surprisingly low. And it was the same for men and women. And that was a real surprise finding. Yeah, so we, in retrospect, would have asked more specific questions around during the homeschooling period and after the homeschooling period. But for most states, the homeschooling was quite brief at this point in July when the survey was conducted. So Sue and I had this bit of a revelation that place of work maybe is more important than hours of work. Some of our other comments from women who worked part-time said they're actually able to increase their hours by being at home and not needing to leave the office to be home and manage children returning from school and things like that, having an adult in the house. They were actually able to work more hours. So we found that really interesting. We asked a few questions around productivity, which is hard to measure in the public service, not quite as neat perhaps as in a teaching and research environment in the university sector. 60% felt that they had more autonomy over when they worked. So there's a slight difference between men and women there. Men feeling that they had more autonomy over when they worked. 2/3 felt they got more work done at the office, and there's a bigger gender difference here, with nearly 68% of women compared to 60% of men. So people feeling they were more productive working at home. And 1/3 felt they were able to undertake more complex work, and whether we didn't get them to break that down as to whether that was related to COVID policies and the uncharted territory they were working in, or what that was due to. But we were quite surprised at the small gender difference there. And this one here, or got more work done at home, we think can possibly be explained by better scope to balance domestic and work responsibilities. We asked a little bit around productivity and caring responsibilities. And we very mixed comments and experiences. We can't really say definitively much on this one. 82.6% reported more time for themselves than their families, not surprising. Half felt more able to help with caring responsibilities, that was both men and women. But lots commented on that lack of separation between work and home, meaning blurred boundaries. As I said at the beginning, public servants less used to working from home than academics. Both men and women perceived they were better able to reconcile work and caring responsibilities while they were working from home. And this, at the time, was contrasting with other research put out by the Boston Consulting Group. where some workers in other sectors felt less able to reconcile work and caring. And probably go back to Glenda's point that not everybody's household is equal, that people have very different circumstances in their households. And it might be related to the characteristics of public servants there, but without generalising about public servants, higher education levels in the broader labour market perhaps, and maybe a better understanding, or at least work-related understanding of equality. So there could be some factors like that behind these findings and that difference to the broader labour market at the time. We did ask some questions around networking and relationships. We thought this might be a point of difference. Much was the same, but we identified a few concerning trends around mentoring, coaching and professional networks. What was interesting was that we were expecting women to perhaps be at more of a disadvantage, but we found that men were actually more at a disadvantage. I'll just talk through two of these. So around a fifth of workers or respondents said they were less able to maintain professional networks, and they were less able to access opportunities such as new projects or tasks. And then around a quarter said they were less able to mentor, manage or coach others. And about a quarter said they were less able to contact or collaborate with colleagues as needed. And this is one where we found a significant gender difference. And I think that's perhaps because women are more used to managing these things out of hours remotely and more flexibly than maybe men who've been more office-based. So that was interesting. We were expecting women to be at more of a disadvantage, but actually they've been perhaps balancing and coping and devising strategies around this for years. As I said earlier, we had nearly 1,400 managers in our study, and it was really good to see that managers overwhelmingly noted the productivity of their teams. There's this very small number, it was 8.9% on average of managers said they thought their teams were less productive. Majority, around 60%, thought their teams were as productive, and we have quite a lot, around a third, that thought their teams were more productive. And this is an interesting gender difference here, in that female managers were more likely to perceive their teams as more productive working from home. We haven't really unpacked that, but there's some more questions. We can break that down a little bit more to think about whether that's from female-dominated or male-dominated agencies, or maybe women's more readiness to trust employees working from home. We asked questions of managers who talked to this one the other day, so I'll just be brief. We asked questions whether they would be more supportive of working from home in the future. And male managers seem to have had the biggest revelation on this. Lots of people said very few said they would be less supportive than before. Quite a lot of people said they'd be around the same. A handful said somewhat more, but a lot of people said they would be much more, and men seem to have the biggest revelation here. In the text comments that were related to this, lots of people who said about the same commented that they'd always been supportive of this before, so they were about the same, they would remain as supportive as they were before. And we picked out this quote, which was from a female manager, which we thought was interesting. I'd always accepted the department line that working from home is a privilege and not a real workplace. Also that working from home makes you unavailable and disconnects you from the workplace. Discovered that I couldn't have been more wrong. So it was good to see female managers as well as male managers having that revelation. We asked about the future. We asked people about their thoughts. Sorry, Mahani, you're trying to hurry me up?
Sorry.
No, that's all right. We asked around the future preferences. And the most popular choice, I think this is not too dissimilar to what David et al.'s research has found. The most popular choice was some hours from home and some hours from the office. There is quite a big chunk of people who'd like most hours from home, but very few, like we have people who want all hours at work and some people who want all hours at home. But it's not for everybody. Again, picking up on Glenda's comment, we think this is a beautiful quote from one of the respondents. I hate my house, it's cold and the kids are annoying and the dog stinks. So there's not everybody's household is conducive to working from home. Okay, some quick conclusions. So we found working from home was generally a success. So our respondents had maybe the opposite experience to academics in that there was more positive association with working from home, even though some of them worked longer hours. There was a major shift in managers' attitudes towards working from home. Definitely scope to be reviewing these policies which provide almost unlimited access to working from home, it would seem, even the reverse onus of all roles flex, but access to those policies is quite different. We've had much fewer gender differences than we expected, and this was most evident in networking relationships where women were actually faring better than men at maintaining those in the remote or from home environment. Unfortunately, we think that might sabotage working from home in the future. If men think that their careers will be more impacted by not being in the workplace, it may mean that men are keener to return to the office and that it becomes something, which it has been in the public service, something more that women do than men. We've got a few future research questions, and we've got some partners who've agreed to, some other union partners who are going to continue this research with us. What does it mean for these flexible by default policies? What does it mean for these approval processes and discretion? Does that need to be reined in a bit? What does it mean about the transition back to work? We're going to ask some questions around that. We're going to ask about place of work and where they're most comfortable and productive. But our big interest is probably in that longer term impact on careers and work relationships. And we do expect some gender differences there as we ask at a point later this year and again in 2 years around do you think your work opportunities, job allocation, promotions, etc. have been disadvantaged due to working from home? Okay, that's all from me.
Thank you, Linda. So any question from Linda and Sue?
There's a question in the chat from David to Linda. On connections, we also found, also contrary to my priors, that men did slightly worse than women. Your connections with colleagues decreased. Academic men, 80%, women, 76%, general professional staff, men, 68%, and women, 66%. So it's a comment, sorry, rather than a question.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and we did you come to the same conclusion as us? That maybe it's just because women were a bit more used to doing that, maybe more.
Yeah, like probably a bit more used to it. Yeah.
Any other questions? All good. Okay, so maybe thank you, Linda and Sue. Maybe we continue the discussion of all papers in the evening after all presentations. We are going to have a very short break because we went over time. So we are going to have only 15 minutes of break and we come back at 3:10. So, and then we start with the next presentation, which is from Sue Rashia, and the title is Working from Home During COVID-19, How Women Managers Manage Remote Work Teams. Okay, see you all in 15 minutes.
Discovered that, well, hold on a minute, we might have a case, they might have a case here for demanding more pay because we actually have evidence of the amount of work and the number of hours they're really putting in.
Yeah, I think that does answer that to a way that answers the question about would it have been different if it had been done in an orderly way. As Sue mentioned earlier, there would have been the development of some policies, etc., around this.
Yeah, yep.
We're getting fragmentation.
Yeah, I think so. But from the responses that I've been looking at, I don't hold out a great hope that HR will actually be able to manage this properly.
Any comments from anyone else along those lines?
We had a couple of comments from Sandra Martin. Would you like to join us live, Sandra?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm definitely not putting on my camera because I'm still in my pajamas. You started very early for Perth. And I've been interested to stay online all day. But as I said before, it would be really interesting to see, you know, a year on, as Amy said, or 2 years on, to see what actually happens in reality, because like people were shoved into a situation not of their own making, and now managers have some discretion. And in my situation, managers have got positive feedback from staff and students. I'm at a TAFE about the online, and they want us to work more online, but are now calling us back into work to do that online, which is a bit strange. And secondly, I was just saying that I think the experience of homeschooling and working from home was really different for single mums and single parents. And it would be interesting to drill down into that, you know, should the data get collected again.
Yeah, I think we could do some of that, David, can't we? Now, looking at isolation and loneliness was certainly an issue for a lot of people living alone too.
Yeah, that's right. But what Sandra says about it being interesting to do a longitudinal study or two, I think that's spot on. In our case, it would be a challenge getting some of the university vice chancellors to agree to running it again. But you never know, you're luck in the big city. I don't know how Sue and Linda would go with whether, are you guys planning on doing this again in a couple of years' time? Have your funders decided that this is an interesting thing? Because it would really be interesting to look particularly at middle managers and see, what are you doing? Have you gone back to the old status quo ante or to something new? And why did you do it? And work out what are the factors that shaped that. So are you guys planning on doing that sort of thing?
We sure are. Yeah, we're just finalising some wording with some union partners at the moment to ask the questions in around March or April. This and then again in 2 years. Yep. Yeah, to just find out that immediate transition back stuff, and then in 2 years the longer term impacts on careers. And
yeah, that'll be really interesting, I think.
On the smell of an oily rag at the moment, though. Yeah. We're waiting for funding advice, but
at least you have a rag.
Not really. It's pretty tattered.
Or else there only has the smell of the oily rag. Yeah. Or oil, Lisa said. Or oil, that's right. Oh dear. Yes, it's a difficult time for all of us with research funding, that's for sure.
I think, can I just make a comment? I think listening to the questions around the university study, I think the stark contrast for us probably with the public sector study is they've had those policies in place for years, but managers have resisted using them. Where I think the difference in the university sector, you didn't have them, ours were actively resisted. And that might have been the reason for a higher level of satisfaction, because they expected the worst from these policies and were surprised when the world didn't end and people were productive. And yes, I did.
Excellent conclusion.
That's an interesting point. And
I've just made that up on the spot, but
those two very different groups in the universities. The academics who've been doing this for years, but every so often some bright spark senior manager says, oh, you should spend more time on campus. Mm-hmm. And so there's often that bit of intention there. Whereas for the general staff, that's pretty much been a policy-free zone, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them have spent all their time working on campus. There's a small number, maybe a fifth or something, I can look it up, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, who when we asked what was your working arrangement prior to COVID, they'd be implying that it was like, you know, a tenth of the time or something like that they'd be working from home. But there were more who just spent all of their time on campus. Very different from pandemic.
We used to have this ridiculous policy that all of our postgrad students, all of our PhD students had to be on campus every single day. And we would argue with them, these are adults, they should be able to work from home if they want. And it was, nope, they have to sit there with all the other postgrad students. So COVID has been good for our PhD students.
I think when I did my PhD, they gave me a room which I wished to share with 2 other people. And I went into it probably twice during the whole time I was a candidate. So I'm glad I didn't do it. But actually, it's the same university. It was the same university. So I was lucky with the timing on that front.
Tim has raised, and Lisa Heap have raised, the question about employment in universities, of how many people have lost jobs, and also the high percentage of precarity. And we know that it's very high. From our earlier survey, we were surprised that 25% of the professional staff were on contracts and precarious arrangements. We knew already that the overwhelming majority of research staff and teachings, and a lot of teaching staff, were on very precarious arrangements. But, you know, 25% of the professional staff, that was a couple of years ago, that's a large percentage as well. So we don't really know about, some of the people who answered our survey were in precarious working arrangements and talked about losing their jobs. But I guess the long-term impact is for the privileged, not those who've left the workforce or have reduced hours, you know. So
we also had a comment from Suzanne Maloney that said she's interested for men from men's perspective, the impact on careers and also adverse on networking. It's about the previous presentation, maybe linked. I'm not sure which one she is referring to. Suzanne, is she here?
No, Suzanne Maloney's not here anymore, unfortunately.
Yes,
That's a pity.
okay, we're losing participants. We're down to 26 participants. Yeah, so, well, perhaps if and others might like to sum up, but for me, it's been a very good selection of papers that have raised the range of issues, starting with Sarah's macro level policies and issues down to the employment levels. And we've teased out things perhaps like the difference between the public sector and universities with and without macro policies, the position of managers, etc. there. It's gone across a good range of issues as far as I'm concerned. And given us all, those people who have been developing papers, some great food for thought, and possibly links too. So anyone in the session who wants to link back with someone, who's got ideas, link together, please do that. Unfortunately, we can't go and share a drink over at the bar and talk about all this as normal at AIRANZ. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody for that. It's, from my point of view, it's been really excellent. Over to you, Mahan, I think.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great session, and thank you for this opportunity, especially with the mentoring of Glenda, David, Sue, and Amy. Thank you all for this great session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you in person next year. Thanks, everyone.